Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Habitus. My name is Michael Pattison. I'm here with my co-host, Bobby Lowe. Welcome to our 10th episode. Please follow us on SoundCloud and Stitcher and TuneIn and Twitter and all the rest of it. Bobby promises me that we're going to be on YouTube sooner rather than later. Now, if I may ask for your patience here, I'm going to explain a few rule changes or rules to be imposed upon the template of our podcast henceforth. So the last two episodes were a 2017 end-of-year wrap-up and a kind of a bumper special to do with Star Wars and 7 other Christmas movies. Before then, episode 7 was we'd kind of settled into a routine of discussing 4 films per episode that we were kind of deciding on at random. We're still going to be choosing the films randomly, but within, from now on, hopefully, certain parameters. We've set 2 criteria by which we choose films moving forward. I sound like a businessman. The first of these is that we're not going to discuss more than one film from a single decade. And the second is that we're imposing upon ourselves the rule that, okay, so I'm going to choose a film each episode which I've seen before, but Bobby hasn't. Bobby's going to return the favour by choosing a film that he's seen before, but I haven't. And then between us, 2 further films, one of which neither of us has seen, and the other of which we've both seen but haven't watched recently to revisit, which I think encompasses a broad range of possibilities. So this episode we're going to discuss, surprise, surprise, 4 films. We're going to discuss them in chronological order, but I'm now going to run through them in reverse chronological order so that we have the dramatic impact of me leading into our first film. So at the end of the show, we're going to be discussing 36, or The 36th Precinct by Olivier Marchal from 2004, which I've seen before, but Bobby hasn't. He hasn't seen it before watching it in preparation for this episode. Before then, we'll be discussing The Two Jakes by Jack Nicholson, the 1990 film, which neither of us has seen and which I chose. Before then, we'll be discussing The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, Tobe Hooper's 1986 horror sequel, which both of us have seen before. Bobby chose that one for us to revisit. And now, at the top of the show, we'll be discussing John Guillermin's 1974 film, The Towering Inferno, which Bobby has seen previously and assigned me to watch for the very first time.
Architects. Yeah, it's all our fault. Now, you know there's no sure way for us to fight a fire in anything over the 7th floor. But you guys just keep building them as high as you can.
Hey, are you here to take me on or the fire?
I want to see all your floor plan, 81 through 85.
Gotcha.
This is what I'm worried about, all those beams and that glass.
Straight.
Chief,
Yeah.
81 has been evacuated, but it doesn't look too good up there.
How long before you can give me a complete list of your tenants?
Oh, you don't have to worry about that. We're moving them out right now.
Not live-in, business tenants.
Well, we kind of looked up there, too. The majority of them haven't moved in yet, and those that have aren't working tonight.
I want to know who they are, not where they are.
And what does that got to do with anything, who they are?
Do you have any wool or silk manufacturers? You see, in a fire, wool and silk give off cyanide gas. Do you have any sporting good manufacturers, like table tennis balls? They give off toxic gases. Now, do you want me to keep going down the line?
No. One list of tenants coming right up.
Thank you. Go over here and here. What do we got?
Well, elevator bank central core. Service elevators over here. Air conditioning duct 6 inch.
Pipe alleys here?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
This is south.
South.
Have you got any construction going up in 81?
Nope.
Anything that could blow up, like gasoline, kerosene, fabric cleaner?
I don't think so.
Good, I'll be up in 81. Okay. For what it's worth, architect, this is one building that I figured wouldn't burn.
Neither did I.
So, The Towering Inferno was released in December 1974 in the US. It was based on 2 novels, adapted, firstly, it was adapted from The Tower, which is a 1973 novel by Richard Martin Stern, and also The Glass Inferno by Thomas N. Scorcher and Frank M. Robinson, which was released in 1974, the year of the film, which suggests that the rights were bought and it was beginning to be adapted even before the book was published, the second book. But producer, interestingly, Irwin Allen, had suggested that if both of these novels were to be adapted as separate films, which was the original plan from two different studios, then the two different films were going to be made by Warner Brothers and Fox, and if both were to go ahead, they would kind of devour one another at the box office and not make much money. So Irwin Allen, producer, suggests that it would be good if the studios kind of combined, came together, and made one single film for $14 million.
And do you know if one of those projects, that Steve McQueen was attached to one of the projects and Paul Newman to the other, or was that something that came together under Irwin Allen?
Yeah, I'm actually not sure. I don't know. I know that there's... So the Tower is based in... It's set in New York City. The film is San Francisco. Sorry, the Tower is set in New York City. The Glass Inferno is in an unnamed city, and it's a much smaller skyscraper. I think it's 65 stories high. The one on the Tower is 125 stories high, located near to the World Trade Center. The one in the film is in San Francisco and is 138. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Something like that,
yeah. And so I think, obviously it speaks for itself, but it was a profitable decision to make one single film because it made $116 million in North America alone, as opposed to a $14 million budget. Yeah. It also went on to be nominated for a Best Picture, which...
It kind of stands out among the...
surprised.
It stands out among the other nominees that year, like The Conversation and Godfather Part 2.
Yeah. Yeah, and you'd seen this film before. I mean, we'll get to it, what we think, but I hadn't seen it before. I'll just very quickly run down a very brief synopsis of the movie.
Sure.
So, Doug Roberts is an architect played by Paul Newman, who returns to San Francisco, having been away somewhere, I forget where he's been. But he comes back for the opening of the film, I guess. They're going to have some grand party on the 80th. No, it's is it the top floor?
It's not. It's the 80th. It's the fire's on the 81st floor. That's where
the fire starts on the promenade room's on the 135th.
Right. Okay.
So there's 3 stories above it, which comes into play at the very end of the film. But so he returns for this party and soiree, and it comes to light very quickly in the film that because there's a fire that begins on the 81st floor during kind of just like a routine sort of test procedure, as a result of which Roberts suspects that the Roger Simmons, who's the electrical subcontractor, has kind of cut corners in implementing the blueprints and whatever else in the construction of the of the building. Now, Roberts is the son-in-law of James Duncan, the contractor of the building, and so they're in this building, as well as like lots and lots of la-di-da guests. And then the fire spreads and escalates very rapidly, very dramatically. The party's going on. The guests eventually get wind of it. Meanwhile, from downtown San Francisco, forgive my geography, never been there, comes Chief Michael O'Halloran and the San Francisco Fire Department. O'Halloran played by Steve McQueen, who is a kind of nuts and bolts sort of hero, right? Like an unsung American, ordinary kind of guy who just wants to get the job done.
There's a dedication. The film opens
old-fashioned way.
The film opens with a dedication to the heroism of American firefighters.
Yeah. And over the course of the remainder of the film, it's 170 minutes,
165 minutes,
something like that. 165 minutes in total. The the first cut that we get to the raging fire happens around about the 30-minute mark.
Yeah, the fire starts quite quickly though. It starts around 12 minutes into the film.
Yeah, and you're like, oh, okay, here we go.
Yeah,
and so
Steve McQueen shows up.
It's
45 minutes in.
Yeah, and then in the ensuing narrative, it's just about the kind of logistics and kind of banal practicalities of problem solving.
Yeah.
Which, okay, so getting to the film itself and my reaction to it, I hadn't seen it before, and I think I've seen 10 minutes here and there on TV, and it always seems to be the same 10 minutes. It's always the scene in which the fire stairs have all kind of, the banisters and stuff have collapsed, and Paul Newman has to negotiate his way down onto the other floor
with the kids,
with the woman and child. Yeah.
That's funny. I anticipated you saying it would be that scene for some reason.
Really?
But yeah, and that's funny. It's funny. I knew that the film was a co-production of two studios. I didn't realize that it was going to be originally going to be two separate films. Because it also has two credited directors. So it's John Guillermin is the director of credit, but then also Irwin Allen gets a credit for directing the action scenes, which is a hugely substantial part of the film. Really, the more memorable part of the film is seemingly what Irwin Allen was responsible for. If Guillermin just did the sort of setup and the quieter character moments. You mentioned Paul Newman's character coming back from somewhere. For the opening, there is some sort of setup. He's supposed to be quitting architecture and moving up into the mountains or something like that. And the owner of the building is saying, "Oh, you're a city boy, and you'll be bored up there in 2 weeks." And that goes nowhere. At the end of the film, he's still an architect, and he's Steve McQueen's character says to him, we had a relatively low death toll, only 200 people died, and someday you're going to kill 10,000 people in one of these fire traps until you start asking us how to build them. And he says, well, okay, I'm asking. I don't know what the purpose of that setup is that he's going to continue being an architect.
The implication, I suppose, is that you have to continue being an architect because you can't, how dare you retire from this having not mastered your craft, and maybe sets it up for a sequel. But I like this film a lot.
Yeah, I think it's good.
It's got this persistent and yet very sort of unsensational build.
Mm-hmm.
Like as you said, it's 12 minutes into the film where the fire begins, and as I said, it's 30 minutes where we really we just get that shock cut almost to the whole room kind of on fire, like this raging inferno.
Yeah, it breaks out in a storage room. So it can kind of gradually build,
But because, the nemesis of this film is, fire, there's no, obviously there's villains in that, Simmons as being the one who's, cut corners, right? But it's about people having to come together to sort of negotiate a horrible, tremendous task. And triumph over it through their collaboration. And so you get all of these different little nuanced relationships that build over the course of the film. And, Newman and McQueen, it's set up in such a way that we're waiting for those two to kind of meet.
Yeah.
And they do, but then, and then they spend a lot of time kind of separated from one another as well, going about their respective tasks. And it's just an extremely well-edited, well-crafted film. Extremely well told.
Right. And would you, if we were to separate the film into action scenes and non-action scenes and attribute that to Irwin Allen and John Guillermin, who would you credit with the film's merits?
With having made the film, I don't know. I mean,
because Allen doesn't get a co-director credit. It says action scenes directed by Irwin Allen, and then you get the screenwriter credit, and then you get the producer credit, and then you finally get directed by John Guillermin. But I mean, the film is there's got to be an hour and a half of action in it. It's an action type film.
It's action, but it's more like tension.
Right, but when okay, so I mean, John Guillermin is, I'm sure, responsible for the first hour, let's say.
Yeah.
But after that, it's a lot of like the whole sequence where they're trying to get the people off the out of the party room using the, what do they call it?
Yeah.
I can't remember the name they use for the wire cable thing that they have, the cable chair thing.
Oh right, yeah. Well, this is after, I suppose, the scenic elevator, when that collapses.
Yeah.
When that falls off the side of the building, and McQueen has to dangle himself from the helicopter and attach the cable to the scenic elevator. So, for instance, would that be an action scene for you?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then. Yeah,
and like any of the scenes, scenes with people burning, any of the scenes that involve like the firefighters fighting the fires, I would assume that that's what action sequences means. Yeah, in the context of
and
this
the scene to which I alluded earlier of Newman having to negotiate that climbing frame.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
I would have thought so.
Collapsed banister. Yeah,
I think John Guillermin had gone home at that point.
It's action in the sort of Thunderbirds, Michael Burke and the 999 team vein, right? It's not like,
I mean, it's,
when people say
action scenes, they kind of mean something that didn't really come into existence fully until the 80s. You know, there were a few sort of proto action films in the 60s and 70s, but this was like disaster movies were sort of the major action films of the 70s. And this was made
in the wake of Poseidon.
Right, exactly. I was going to ask you, like, do you like disaster movies, and have you seen many of the 70s classics?
No, I haven't, and I haven't seen the Poseidon Adventure either, which is odd given my fandom of Gene Hackman. But I mean, I don't dislike them. I think I'm put off by their bloated length, or what ostensibly is a bloated length, and the steady build of them, and so I'll say that this film sort of converted me into, a mindset where I'm much more sort of welcoming of the idea of a disaster movie, watching one. Because it's as I said, it's strong storytelling, it's character based.
I have seen the Poseidon Adventure, but I haven't seen any of the other ones. I haven't seen Earthquake or Airport 75, or there were a bunch of airport movies. One of them is a disaster movie. It's weird,
like some disasters appeal to me more.
Yeah.
Like, and a building on fire, I guess, appeals to me a lot more than like an earthquake. Watching a dramatic or dramatization of that event.
Yeah.
Like, I haven't seen Volcano or Dante's Peak, for instance, which came out decades later and actually at the very much the same time as one another, and kind of in retrospect justify Alan's decision, I think, to produce the two books as one film, because that is an textbook example of two films kind of very, very much similar to one another, coming released.
And the following year you had both Deep Impact and Armageddon.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
And have you seen any of the newer ones? Have you seen like any of the other Roland Emmerich films, like The Day After Tomorrow or 2012? No,
I haven't. But you see, like, they're very much situated in line with like a coming sort of apocalypse, right?
Yeah.
Whereas something like the Towering Inferno and the Poseidon Adventure are very specific to the vessel or the building, which is why
they're more everyday kind of like news stories.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, I think fire is scary. I mean, like the idea of like, a sinking ship is scary too. But there's something really violent and dynamic about fire. And it has a kind of a living sort of energy that water doesn't necessarily have. But I agree with you about the build up. I like how it's paced and I like how it's structured. I like the fact that the fire starts 12 minutes into the film. Actually, it's like if you cut the 5-minute helicopter shot, from the beginning of the film, it's actually 7 minutes. 7 minutes into the film that the fire actually starts. So the disaster is kind of allowed to slowly build, which is not the case if you have something like it's not the case with the Poseidon Adventure. With the Poseidon Adventure, you have a 2.5 hour film where the first hour is literally just getting to know the characters, and you're waiting for the giant wave to hit the ship. And the ship is in the course of one sort of action sequence, the ship is upended. But you're just waiting for that to happen. It's not slowly building. You're not kind of cutting back to it and seeing that it's getting worse and worse and worse. And the same is true of like two. If I could compare it to two recent films, I recently watched The Wave, the Norwegian disaster film. Similar kind of thing. Like the wave is caused by a part of the mountain sliding into the river. And the first like that movie's only 90 minutes long, but like the first half hour or so is one scientist who's worried that that's going to happen, and other scientists who are saying no, don't worry about it, it's fine, and you're just sort of waiting for it to happen, but it's not
right.
You,
so
you don't have to.
I mean, it's structured into the premise then, right? Because the Poseidon adventure doesn't have to be the sea that creates the tension there. It could be a fire on board the ship. Yeah. Which allows for those kind of dramatic ironies and parallel cross-cutting, that where like some people are aware of the fire on the ship, some people aren't. This doesn't have to be a building, for instance, in the Towering Inferno. If you see what I mean, it's like it's impossible for a ship to be overwhelmed by some gigantic wave without everybody on board becoming simultaneously aware of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas, so like the equivalent, I guess, would be not the Towering Inferno, but the collapsing building. Like if the building collapses, just like for whatever reason, everyone in that building becomes aware of it.
Yeah,
right?
like an earthquake. Like the other film I was going to compare it to was was San Andreas.
Yeah.
With The Rock. Again, it's a similar kind of thing where you got a 2-hour movie, and the first like 45 minutes or so is the Paul Giamatti character who's playing this scientist who's like sure that the San Andreas fault is going to cause this massive earthquake, and other scientists going, no, you're crazy. And then you're just you know that he's right, and you're just kind of like, the tension is drawn from you're just waiting for it to happen. You're not watching it slowly unfold.
And those films, particularly these days, have become very sort of sensational and spectacular, and it's about the event itself, whereas this it feels very, very rooted in the relationships that are in flux and building as the film progresses.
Yeah, I like how relatively grounded it is. I like how it's sort of you've got all the different, you got that sort of prismatic sort of perspective on this event from like, I like that it's taking place at a public event, so you have this kind of like you see all the glitzy celebrities arriving for this gala, and then you also have, like, you see the people behind the scenes trying to control the fire that they already know is broken out. So you have this kind of like facade with the behind the scenes. You're getting both perspectives. You're getting the perspectives of the guests and like the technicians working in the tower, and then also the emergency services when they arrive. And yeah, it's good.
And the whole thing, I think, is underscored. What you've just said there, it's all underscored by the intermittent but quietly very powerful establishing shots from like miles and miles and miles away. So you see this tower that's getting gradually worse to fire, like on the horizon of a cityscape. Yeah. Which I love establishing shots like that. Anyway, it's like my thing. I could watch a whole film just like the 3-hour shot of that. But no, one thing we haven't mentioned is Fred Astaire.
I was actually just going to mention him.
Got his only Academy Award nominee for this film of all films. It kind of, it's, not quite at the opposite end of the spectrum of what he was known for, but it's very much sort of against type. I mean, there's no singing and dancing in this.
He does dance very briefly with Jennifer Jones. Yeah.
Yeah, he does. You're right. He's great in it though.
He is good.
I didn't know until after I'd seen it and that he was actually nominated for an Academy Award. He plays a con man.
He plays a con man, and I was initially when I started watching it again this time, I was initially concerned with the sort of soap opera-ish storylines that are not everything in the first like 45 minutes or so is like that, but there are a couple of storylines, and that the Fred Astaire Jennifer Jones on their first date storyline is definitely one of the more soap opera-ish ones. And you also have the Robert Wagner Susan Flannery one where they're I can't even remember the details of that one, but you know the one I'm talking about? Where they're
Gary, he's a senator. No, sorry, that's Robert Vaughn. Dan Bigelow is Robert Wagner. Yeah. He's a sort of, is he the building's public relations officer?
Something like that.
Is he the project? He's there because he's the PR officer of that project, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
and coordinating the press and whatever.
But he's having a rendezvous with.
Just mentioned them.
Yeah. But
yeah, and their end is brutal.
Yeah, I was actually that's the scene that this movie to me is like a quintessential like Sunday afternoon movie. Like like when I was a kid, if my dad was watching it, it would be on, and it would seem to be on all afternoon. You know, like I'd wander in and out of the room, and it would just be on all the time. Like, that one scene, whenever I saw that scene,
movies like that.
I found it really disturbing. The scene where he, like a person burning is such a horrifying image, and the way he dies, like he puts the wet towel over his head, and he runs out and he tries to like kind of dodge around the flames, and he just goes up in flames, and continues to try to run, and then his body just kind of goes unresponsive, and he sort of turns into like a zombie, you know? And falls over the balcony. It's really grim.
Now it's brutal, like surprisingly brutal for a film that would be screened on television often and frequently on a Sunday afternoon, along with whenever Ben-Hur wasn't playing. But you know what this film reminds me of a little bit? Have you ever read Camus' The Plague?
No.
Which was, you know, it's about a town coming together to defeat a plague, right? But it was obviously written as an allegory for resistance to, you know, Nazi-occupied France. And this film, you know, very much lends itself to that kind of reading. I mean, obviously it's a completely different context, but it also in terms of the storytelling mechanics and just how sort of unsensationalist it is, you know, it's a word I keep using, but like it's just about people problem solving, right, from one scene to the next. So like, okay, they put the fire out there, but it's, you know, it's engulfing another room on another floor, so now you've got to go there. Oh, the scenic route, and it's about, you know, navigating the architecture of this building. You know, you mentioned San Andreas, and I can imagine this being remade actually for, you know, the new generation with The Rock. And it would be very, very, very different film.
He's in a film this year called Skyscraper.
Yeah, but I don't know
it's a burning
the
tower.
extent to which it is.
He has to rescue his family from a fire in a skyscraper that he designed. So he's basically playing the Paul Newman character. Right. Also, the imagery of people falling out of the tower. I was reading. I can't remember where it was. If it was on Letterboxd or on IMDb, where apparently this film doesn't play very often on TV in America anymore. Post 9/11, because of the imagery of people falling out of a burning tower, you know, which is kind of understandable. That it's I
mean, it's not so long in the grand scheme of things since, you know, Grenfell in London when I watched it, and you know, those images anyway, regardless of, you know, real life contingencies, they're never not without power.
Yeah, that's true.
Because it's just such an unthinkable scenario to be in.
But at the same time, unthinkable, but not so alien that you can't imagine yourself in it in the same way. Like if you were to look at the Roland Emmerich End of the World films, they're not they're a little bit too outlandish for that, you know. Like Whereas in this one, you can very much imagine, and you can very much like ask yourself, like, what would you do in that kind of situation?
And it plays on very real, very everyday fears to do with, you know, height, for instance. Just, you know, I know people who wouldn't even dare get into, you know, an external, or what's called in this film a scenic elevator, you know, attached to the side of a building. I've never been in one. I'm not sure how I would feel to be in one. But this idea of, you know, like glass boxes as well. So like, you know, the elevation from a city, but also the visibility that it allows as well. Like, and, you know, that's, I find it very rich material on which to build, or a very rich foundation on which to build material. No kind of pun intended.
I love the visual transformation of the environment. Like, you have this really pristine sort of modern tower, like it's a combination office building, residential building. They say that there's offices up to a certain point, and then it's all residential in the upper floors. and you're kind of looking at it going, "Oh, it looks like a really nice place to live." And then gradually, as the fire spreads, it transforms into this weird kind of like almost like a nighttime version of itself. It's like a dark sort of. In the Poseidon Adventure, the world literally turns upside down, but that's essentially what happens in these disaster films, is the environment is transformed into this kind of dark nightmare version of itself, where everything, all of the familiar physical parts of the environment are moved around and changed and made more, impossible to navigate and treacherous and turned into traps and hazards. It's kind of cool to watch that. And particularly in these older films, how it's done physically purely through production design.
Yeah, I agree. And also the grit and dirt that end up, defining the faces of Newman and McQueen, whose handsomeness, of course, is sort of rooted in the way they pick up dirt and grit. But it's true. I mean, I was always drawn to that as a kid watching films as well. And I've mentioned it briefly, but also to Thunderbirds. Right. Like, by the end of every episode in Thunderbirds, like, these puppets would just be, like, obviously still recognizably them, but, just, so, like, worn and dirtied up. I used to love that. I used to love the gradual transformation of, like flesh tones as well. And to riff on something that you've just mentioned there, the environment, the mise en scène being rearranged into a kind of hellish version of itself. On those grounds, the title is great because it's an inferno, of course, but it's also a hellish inferno.
Yeah, a lot of like when they go into like the elevator shafts and things like that, and they have all this like forced perspective stuff. It's really it's really well done. Don't know who to attribute it to, Gearman or Irwin, but can I read you a short review from the 10th Virgin Film Guide from 2002, which I got it in 2002, and I was a little bit affronted by this very dismissive review of this film, because I was always so fond of it.
Right.
Okay, it's only a short one. They're little capsule reviews. Okay, so Burn Baby Burn, and it's not a disco inferno either. The disaster film which mercifully signaled the end of a cycle, The Towering Inferno places an all-star cast consisting mostly of has-beens and never-weres in a spangly glass tower only to torch the sucker. Faye Dunaway looks stoned, Paul Newman and Steve, when are you architects going to learn, McQueen, look bored, William Holden looks sick, O.J. Simpson gets to rescue a cat, Richard Chamberlain is unpleasant, and Fred Astaire and Jennifer Jones act as if the film is entitled The Cowering Inferno. No wonder everybody's so afraid of burning to death here. Their characters are cardboard.
Wow, I mean,
a little harsh.
I'd forgotten about William Holden.
They gave it 2 out of 5.
Jim Duncan, but that's written in retrospect, so it kind of gives the whole derision like a false sense of perspective, like as if looking back, oh God, thank God it ended that cycle. I don't recall what my go-to reviews guide, Halliwell's, made of it. I think it was a 3-star film in that. 2 at the very least, because it's always been on my radar as a result.
Was that out of 4, though?
Yeah, out of 4, yeah.
Right, but that's out of 5. That's 2 out of 5.
Yeah. Wow. No, but also, the Virgin Guide is always, like, very much 1 to 5, being, like, 2 is bad. 2 in a Halliwell's is very good.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's more in line with your own new rating system.
It's well, mine's adopted from Halliwell's. Yeah.
No, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with the like the Fred Astaire Jennifer Jones thing. Like the twist you mentioned, the late twist that he's actually a con man or whatever. We're just not given enough time with those characters for that to have any sort of like meaning.
Yeah.
And she like the whole thing. It's almost like a double twist, because it's set up that this is like their first date. And he's like a wealthy guy from like his like villa in the south of France and all this kind of stuff he's thinking of selling. And then it turns out that he's actually a con man. And then it turns out that she already knew that, but doesn't care. I was like, we just don't have the insight into these characters for that to mean anything.
It's strange, because it's full of these otherwise sort of superfluous, redundant details that in the course of any other 165-minute film would go some way to sort of fleshing out these characters. But obviously there's 2 things to sort of skillfully interweave here, and that's on the one hand characterization or characters, and then on the other the actual thing that they have to overcome. And so a lot of it, obviously, with people like Newman and McQueen, their characters built up through the negotiation of this physical space. But when the characters are aged at a certain when they're of a certain age, like Fred Astaire, it obviously limits what their characters can do in terms of action scenes. Right. And so, you get like kind of overly written little snippets here and there. I didn't find it a problem though. It's
no, it's not, because it doesn't take up any time. But like as I said, like when I started watching it again, I was initially a little bit concerned with how like a soap opera it feels in the first like half hour or so. But once McQueen shows up and the fire proper starts, I think it becomes very absorbing. And then
it's almost
you get into
like
that transformation, and it becomes like this. Yeah. It even has a kind of an almost abstract quality that's like presumably unintentional and attributable to the limitations of special effects. But when they are using, I don't know how big the model was, but the establishing shots of the tower fully on fire that are used like toward the end of the film, like looks very unconvincing. I don't know. I'd like to know how big it is, because you're kind of trying to judge how big it is based on how like the way that the flames are moving. But it's like nighttime. You've got this weird tower that doesn't look like it's made of glass anymore, because they were like burning it. It looks like it's made out of like steel. It looks like a big steel block, and it takes on this weird kind of abstract sort of quality.
Yeah, I agree.
But did you see Deepwater Horizon, the Peter Berg film with Mark Wahlberg it came out in 2016? No. It was about the fire on the oil rig with Kurt Russell and Mark Wahlberg.
No, I didn't see it.
It's good. It's a similar kind of setup as well, like where the disaster is building slowly. It's kind of like they're gradually losing control of the oil rig.
See, and that combines obviously the one setting disaster thing, but it also it's on water, right? Yeah. So it's like Poseidon Adventure meets the Towering Inferno, which obviously the Alpha Piper or Piper Alpha disaster kind of was.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's worth watching.
I say I've always found oil rigs frightening anyway. Like my dad's worked on oil rigs, just the isolation. It's obviously part of the drama and tension here is that there's a whole city around the building, but like an oil rig, there's just nothing. Yeah. Which kind of just exacerbates the horror and terror of it.
Yeah. So what disaster movie would you want to see next? Of the 70s ones?
Well, as now that Virgin's drawn my attention to the fact that this was thankfully the last in a cycle, so the Poseidon Adventure should be my next point of call, because it's it makes perfect sense. But as I said, it appeals less to me because for all the things that you alluded to earlier, like you're just waiting for the thing to happen, and then it happens.
It is pretty visually cool though, the upside down ship. It presents a lot of interesting kind of problems that you would never think of, like how would you actually navigate a space that's upside down. Yeah.
I think about that all the time. Can I say one more thing here? One thing I noted when I was watching it was that I think this film has one of the great movie handshakes, and it's towards the end of the film. I think just when he's when he's negotiated the tricky scenic elevator, when he gets that onto the ground
Steve McQueen
from the helicopter, and Steve McQueen gives a handshake to one of the other firemen, who almost fell off, the elevator, who almost fell off, and it's got a really lovely understated sense of sort of honor and dignity and
camaraderie,
Yeah, absolutely, and it's rooted in this in this almost sort of this masculinity, which I really responded to.
Yeah, okay.
It's
So
it's a nice
what would you
moment.
give this film? Do you want to explain your new rating system, or do you want?
So my new rating system, which we've just sort of mentioned in relation to Halliwell's, I ditched a 10 score system because I was getting fed up of thinking too much about, expending too much energy on mediocre films. And so my new rating system is out of four stars, but 1 to 4 is reserved for the good stuff, and anything that sort of leaves me cold or worse just gets 0 stars. So everything from the terrible to the pretty average is given nothing. So it's designed in in theory, it's designed to allow me a little more sort of scope and leeway for the positives. So for instance, but I am strict with it. So if something gets 2 stars or above with me, you know that I've really, really, really responded to it. I did give the Towering Inferno 2 out of 4.
Now, would you say it's fair to say that what you've done is just lopped off the bottom of your out of 10 system?
I guess so.
So
yeah, I guess so. But psychologically, it feels different because like it doesn't have a natural numerical translation. The star assigning stars. So, for instance, a 2 should be in theory kind of like an 8, right?
Yeah.
Now, in the case of the Towering Inferno, I guess that is the case.
Okay.
Right. It's a solid 8. But for instance, 1 stars can be given to films that I feel have some kind of value that maybe I wasn't fully on board with.
Okay.
But 1 star can also be given to a film that I think is very solidly good without necessarily being great, right? So it gets a little tricky around the 1 star thing.
Okay.
But no system's perfect. But for the interests of clarity and for simplicity reasons, I would give the Towering Inferno 8 out of 10.
Okay, me too.
I can't believe you're very clever. You kind of dragged me back into the old system there. Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. But yeah. Let's proceed for the rest of this episode only by giving stars for me because I want to.
I'm always going to need to translate your stars into out of 10s though.
Yeah, no, it has to be done as I said on a case by case basis. That's the joy of it.
Okay.
There's no easy translation.
All right.
So yeah, 8 out of 10 for both of us. And coming up now is
the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2.
Football fans to feed. Hurry it up. Grandpa likes to go fast. He always did. Come on. Time eats money. Those damn coon shits. On the way to the family. To stoop my shoulders, taking care of my younger brothers. It squashed the young years out of my life. Like a can of cheese whip. I wouldn't wish this rotten life off on a one-eyed ferret with mange. You're the first girl Bubba's brought home to dinner. See, it's a real special occasion. Well, Grandpa sure looks forward to meeting you. He's 137 years old, but still as fast as Jesse James. So don't you worry none. Here comes Grandpa now. God bless you, Grandpa. Oh, it's play time, it's dinner time. Your little boys have some left here for you. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, we do. We love you. We love you.
Okay, so Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, or Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, released in 1986, August of 1986. Directed by Tobe Hooper, written by L.M. Kit Carson, and produced by Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus of the infamous Cannon group. This was Hooper's 3rd film for Cannon. He had done Life Force and the remake of Invaders from Mars, and he originally wasn't going to direct this one, but they couldn't find a director that they were happy with, so he stepped in. The concept of it was also a lot bigger originally. It was originally supposed to be a whole town of cannibals, but they scaled it down. And Cannon were apparently really unhappy with the finished film because they wanted a really intense horror film in the vein of the original film. And what they got was this kind of weird, very overtly comedic riff on the themes and the imagery and the ideas of the original. So the premise of this one is that it's set roughly 10 years later, and 10 years after the events of the first film, and we follow Lieutenant Lefty Enright, played by Dennis Hopper, who is the uncle of Sally and Franklin Hardesty from the first film, and he's convinced that the killers of his nephew Franklin and Sally's other friends in the first film have been carrying out a series of chainsaw murders across the state of Texas in the intervening 10 years, which is something that he can't seem to convince the police of for some reason. They seem very, very reluctant to make any sort of connection between this spate of chainsaw killings that are happening like in the middle of the highway, and but he so there's a late night radio DJ nicknamed Stretch, who gets a call in from two guys who are making a request and get attacked by the Sawyer family while on the phone to the radio DJ. So she ends up with a recording of the attack, and that's how she hooks up with Lefty. And Lefty wants her to play the recording every night to try to sort of goad the killers out of hiding, so that he can track them down. And that's what happens. So
yeah, that's the premise.
That's more or less it. Yeah.
I wasn't aware that Hooper stepped in. Did he step in reluctantly, or
I don't know how reluctantly it was, but the original idea was not for him to direct.
I mean, it's a very, 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 very different film to the first one.
Yeah.
Like the comic, explicitly comic register from the get go.
Uh-huh.
That first, the first killing scene, what you just mentioned there, when the guys are on the phone to the radio station. I mean, it's brutal and horrific, but it's also hilarious in a way that the events in the first film really aren't.
Well, that's interesting because from Hooper's point of view, the jet black comedy streak running through the original film was overlooked, and I think that's fair to say that it is and still is overlooked. Yeah. Was and still is overlooked. I've always seen it though. I've always perceived that in the first film, that there is this like jet black, like blackest black humor, undercurrent running through the film.
Yeah, I think there's the first sort of seems to operate within a very like realism, like verite almost mode, and so feels almost like a documentary at points. It which I suppose obviously it's a stylistic choice, but this one feels very much more engineered in a way,
right? And
so perhaps the comic stuff feels a little more written.
Well, this is. I mean, I would agree with you that this is much more overtly comic. It's not kind of a undercurrent here. It's very on the surface. It's very played up in a way that this is not as intense or as sort of nerve wracking as the original film. Partly because I think it doesn't have a slasher film structure. We don't have like the original is. I mean, not that I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as a teen. It's not really a teen slasher film, but it's kind of like one of the early backwoods slashers. Where
it's a prototype for what became.
Yeah. Like along with The Hills Have Eyes in the 70s, like these kinds of, or even Deliverance would be a sort of a proto backwoods slasher as well. Mm-hmm. You have the people from the city visiting the country and getting attacked by the local, inbred hillbilly cannibals. That's not, the structure doesn't apply to this film at all. This is a much more sort of unpredictable sort of film, I would say. Like you don't, like from the point where you start, you really don't know where it's going.
Yeah, well, I think that's highlighted in the difficulties in synopsizing it.
Yeah.
Like, you did a pretty good job, but you began with a character who's not introduced immediately. He becomes the sort of joint chief protagonist, but Caroline Williams as Stretch is also, she has equal airtime, no pun intended. So the whole the first killing that we've mentioned is a prologue to what becomes the film in a way. It's like an extended.
Yeah.
That has to happen for Dennis Hopper's character to be introduced.
Yeah, yeah.
If you see what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's structurally very, very different, and because of that, a lot more predictable, and a lot
more unpredictable.
a lot more unpredictable. Yeah. Sorry, and also, it accommodates an escalation in scale, I suppose, as well, because it's very not multiple states, but obviously they've been operating in multiple states at the film's opening.
Right. So one thing that I left out of the premise there is that. This is something that's in the original film, but it's expanded and brought to the surface in this one. Is that this is a business venture for this family, that they are the champion chili cook-off. Every year that they win this chili cook-off, and they
Texas Oklahoma chili cook-off,
right? And it's because of when they're asked what their secret is, it's like the meat. Don't skimp on the meat, and obviously the meat that they're using is human meat. From these people that they're killing, and it's there's this in the original and in most backwoods slasher movies, there isn't this capitalistic kind of motivation for this the family business, there's a whole thing about this comes from the original film, that this is a family who. 3 generations who have always worked in slaughterhouses and have prided themselves on it and have worked there because they love killing animals, and that they really don't draw a distinction between cattle and their human victims. But all of that is brought to the surface here. They talk very openly about automation in the industrial farming that drove their grandfather out of he was the best at like hitting cattle with a hammer or something like that, and then once that skill became obsolete, he was driven out of the business. And all of that is like rooted in that kind of very iconic kind of Texas culture of like the barbecue and the cattle and the industrial farming and the ranching and the brutality associated with that, and particularly with the heavy industrialization of that industry, and the way those people are, or the way those animals are treated.
So it's a literal manifestation of ready-made allegories, right? Taking capitalism to its logical extension,
right,
of,
sure.
Preying upon human flesh, basically.
Yeah.
And yet it still feels kind of ludicrous, and the way in which it's presented is kind of ludicrous and whatever else, outlandish even, but actually rooted very much in fears, like not even fears, but like actual what happens under capitalist mode of production.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you said that the film is a very, very different film from the original.
Yeah.
I actually think that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series in general is very varied from film to film.
Right.
Like there really are no two entries there are 8 entries in the series, and there really are no 2 that are alike, except maybe arguably the remake and its prequel, which are kind of similar, but other remake and its prequel included in the 8. So these are the only 2 films I've seen in what is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series. Okay. So I
haven't seen any of those.
The third one from 1990 stars Viggo Mortensen and is a direct sequel to this, although the continuity in the series where it exists is pretty light, taken pretty lightly.
Right.
Then the fourth one is a remake starring Matthew McConaughey and Renee Zellweger, which was written and directed by Kim Henkel, who had been the co-writer on the original but had fallen out with Tobe Hooper and wanted to make his own version of it. Then there was the remake. Then there was a prequel to the remake, both starring Arlie Ermy. Then there was the really confusing Texas Chainsaw 3D, which was ostensibly set 20 years after the events of the original film, but was clearly set in the 2010s. And then there was the the new one, directed by the directors of Inside, Julian Maury and Alexander Castillo, called Leatherface, which is another prequel, like an origin story for Leatherface, which was not great. But they're all quite different. You know, there's not really a sense of like, there's a sense of like handing this material to a new filmmaker and saying like, what can you do with this, and letting them reimagine it, which is it makes for quite an interesting set of films. You know,
I remember you once saying that at a certain point, given, you know, if they're allowed to run long enough, there's a tendency for horror franchises to become comic anyway, to become, you know, the comical elements get foregrounded. I don't know if you recall saying that.
Yeah, sure. I think that's probably true. Yeah.
But yeah,
and then eventually,
is that true of this one? Would you say, or does it come full circle and become nasty again?
Yeah, it comes back, and I think that's also part of that same tendency, is that it reaches a point where it kind of bottoms out, and then it sort of is reset. They kind of go back to what worked originally. With this one, I mean, this is by far the most openly comedic of them. Number 4 is pretty comedic as well, but the others are not really. Everything else in the series is pretty serious. Yeah. And
is that, if I may, you know, risk a tangent here, do you think that tendency is based upon, you know, the sort of increasing narrowness with which a world that's built serially kind of its narrowing appeal, if you like, and therefore becomes an ironic sort of, it can't help but become this sort of self-regarding, well, not self-regarding, but like it can't help but become this kind of knowing fabric that, you know, kind of has to become a comment on itself or become about itself, and therefore, you know, in reference and whatever else, which obviously lend themselves to comic treatments more than they do to, you know, playing something straight.
I don't know if it's inevitable or necessary, but it certainly is a tendency. Yeah, I mean, by the time like you get to like for example, if you take the Friday the 13th series, by the time you get to Jason X and Freddy vs. Jason, the films are being written by people who grew up watching the films originally, and who grew up in a culture where those characters and that sort of that material was like circulating in pop culture. So it kind of it tends toward this kind of postmodern reimagining. I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre has probably escaped that largely. It's been taken fairly seriously in its later incarnations.
You've mentioned Leatherface, that, you know, as the title of the prequel, the origin story. For me, played by Bill Johnson, part of what makes this film fundamentally different to the first one is its treatment of Leatherface.
Yeah, very much so.
Its attempt to expand him as a character. I mean, what roots the terror of the first film for me is that awful image of him first opening the door when we first discover who he is, and then secondly when you know he's in the house, and then the second victim goes in and he just comes running out through the hallway. That is just awful stuff. Whereas here, there's nothing that really gets the scene, even close to that.
The scene where she escapes from the house and he comes out of the front door and grabs her and she's almost out and he pulls her back in.
Yeah, that's what I'm.
Oh, sorry. Okay, and he pulls her into the what would you call that room? The killing room or whatever. And it's like a meat locker, isn't it? Yeah, the meat locker. Yeah, so he pulls her into the meat locker and slams the door and like locks us out. You know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, I totally agree. I mean,
it's awful.
But
and
I don't. Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, he's just you know, there's moments of like, you know, borderline sympathy with him, like kind of treating him as this like pathetic creature who, like, you know, has these moments of identifying with Stretch, and he has this weird obvious sexual fascination with her, but which allows him to hide her, and she plays on that in order to survive.
But now when you say that that's the thing that's the major point of differentiation between this and the original, is that a negative for you?
No, it's not. It's just I'm trying to discern what makes it, specifically what makes it different. And I think it is rooted on the treatment of the Leatherface character. Of course, we have a protagonist here. Of course, it has a protagonist character in Lefty who is actively investigating this family, and so he's in a position of, relative power in a way that the protagonists in the first film weren't.
Yeah, and he's not afraid of them either.
Yeah.
He actually says that. He says he's not afraid to die, and they thrive on fear, so they don't have any power over him. But yeah, very much so. So you have the fact that you have a knowing protagonist as opposed to unknowing protagonists who are sort of stumbling into this terrifying environment that they didn't anticipate in the first film.
Yeah,
and then you also have Leatherface as you have a more psychological treatment of Leatherface.
Even his mask's different, which allows for, just a different reading. His face can be read in a way that his face couldn't in the first.
Yeah. The film, when I was rewatching it this time, I was thinking of how it anticipates both Evil Dead 2 and Phantasm 2, which came out the following 2 years. In the turn toward the sort of comic book register that it takes.
You mean in terms of visual palette
in every respect, in terms of the way that the characters are treated, in terms of the tone of the film. Even the fact when I compare this to the original Texas Chainsaw or Phantasm 2 to Phantasm or Evil Dead 2 to Evil Dead, they have that kind of over the top comic book kind of quality. In this one, even the fact that the Sawyer, first of all, the fact that they're called the Sawyer family, like the Sawyer family, which is obviously a joke. They weren't named in the original film.
No.
And that name, obviously introduced in this film as a joke, has persisted through the more serious sequels. They're still called the Sawyers. The other characters, like the fact that they all have comic booky kind of nicknames, like Stretch and Lefty, Chop Top.
Yeah.
And the fact that they actually call Leatherface, and you have the tooling up scene where Dennis Hopper goes to the chainsaw shop and tries out all the different chainsaws.
Just a wall of chainsaws.
And then you have the visual character quirks, like Chop Top scratching his metal plate in his head with the wire hanger, and Stretch's friend LG constantly spitting.
Yeah,
even when he's being murdered.
yeah. I think that's the best scene of the film.
When he's being
the whole build up to that. When they go to the radio station, when they first show up, and he's scratching his head, and we're not really sure if the Leatherface is with him at that point or whatever. There's a tension there that I think also transcends the comic.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that's the best scene of the film. I think the best material in this film is Leatherface's relationship with Stretch. You're including that scene in that when you talk about it.
The whole sequence,
the "How good are you" scene, where she keeps asking him "How good are you?" and it's this weird ambiguous question, and she opens her legs and he puts the chainsaw in between her legs, and he's been sawing the ice box full of beer, and there's beer spraying everywhere. And she keeps saying, how good are you? How good are you? And he has the phallic chainsaw. It's so good. And then that's carried over into the... he's doing this weird thrusting thing with the chainsaw as well. And then that's carried over into the scene where she finally... Sorry, we should also elaborate on the premise that it turns out they have taken over this theme park kind of place called Texas Battle Land. Which is this weird, like creepy underground cavernous place with it's all about the battle of I'm not sure what historical battle it necessarily was referring to, but when she ends up in there, she ends up in the room where Leatherface is butchering LG and skinning him. And then Leatherface discovers her, and she pleads with him to help her get out of there. So he puts LG's face on her face and then starts like dancing with her, and then he hides her again when Chop Top comes in, and Leatherface leaves, and then turns out LG's not dead yet, and he gets up and his face has been removed, and a whole portion of the skin on his chest and legs have been removed. Yeah. And it's just such an incredible sequence. It's so good. He wakes up to see somebody wearing his face, and it turns out that it's his friend Stretch, and the whole sequence is amazing. It's like it's funny, and it's also sad, and it's like manic and weird and gross and tense, and it just has all these layers. It's such a great sequence. Yeah, that's my favorite
a close second. Yeah, that's a close second for me to the radio station. So like, you know, Chop Top when he first arrives at the radio station, I think that's kind of the best.
Right.
It's the most sustained stint of tension in the film.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
But I mean, some of the Hopper's great in this. Like, I don't know, like I'm not sufficiently familiar, and I haven't researched the context of his career at this point. Like,
well, at the time he said that this was the worst film he'd ever been in.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that's not true.
It's not. And he later said that Super Mario Brothers was the worst film he'd ever been in. So I don't know. I guess that
right.
No, it's definitely not true.
Nah, I mean, he's so good in it though. Like, you know, for an actor to say that would suggest, you know, if you hadn't seen the film, would suggest that maybe he didn't want to be part of it. But there's no evidence of that in the film. I don't think. You know, he plays it kind of straight. It's an odd casting choice. It's not a natural casting choice, I don't think. But like, you know, when he first shows up and speaking to is it the highway patrolman or the traffic cops, and you know, they're adamant, as you said earlier, that you know, this isn't anything to do with you know, murder. He says one of those boys was so wild he sawed his own head off. He sawed his own head off going 90 miles per hour. And you know, the line read in you know, inimitably Hopper-esque way is so great. Like, cuts to the chase,
and it doesn't really.
I love it. I mean,
that storyline doesn't really resolve itself or
no.
even undergo any sort of elaboration. It's just like, for some reason, the cops will not accept that there are like, what's obviously happening here is that these people are being murdered with chainsaws, and for some reason the cops won't accept it. I love the Texas Battleland though. It's like it's this kind of like when Hopper first goes down in there. It's like this. The production design is so amazing, and it's like this weird kind of Freudian subterranean world where the walls, like there's a mural of the battle, and he kicks the wall and the wall breaks, and the walls are literally full of guts, like the guts like come pouring out of the wall, and he calls it the Devil's Playground, and like the production design is so incredible. My favorite piece of it is the cowboy skeleton riding the bomb. It's fantastic. Like the whole like cavernous space is like so much attention to detail. It's really great. It like takes the way in the original film they have furniture made out of bones. It takes that like to like a crazy surreal kind of like nightmare level. It's great.
And Lefty's arrival at that cave coincides with Stretch's attempt to leave it, right?
Well, so she
because there's that great moment where he goes, "Come on, little sister, grab onto it," and he holds
out something, and it turns out that it's the arm of a skeleton.
It's a skeleton hand. Yeah,
it's great. That's when she fought. Yeah, because he's actually been using her as bait to try to lure them out. Yeah. So he was manipulating her. And then you have the sort of partial recreation of the dinner scene from the original film, where they're trying to get the grandpa to hit her with a hammer, and I love in the scene where LG comes back to life. I love the fact that they use his character quirks, the spitting, and the fact that he calls Stretch darling, as a way of her realizing that that's LG, because he has no face. She doesn't realize that she's wearing his face. It's great. The Vietnam aspect of it is also much more overt in this one than it is in the original. Like they talk openly about it. Like Chop Top says something about like their business actually being funded by like his veterans disability welfare allowance. He says something about if it wasn't for one lucky gook with a machete, none of this would be happening, and like you should kiss my metal plate.
Yeah, but I mean, it's mentioned more, but there's nothing really much more made of it, right? It's like it isn't used.
Well, I mean, the whole thing is supposed to be apparently like a response to Vietnam, the original film,
right?
Like in Hooper's opinion, the film is supposed to be kind of like evocative of that kind of like slaughter and madness. But I also love the scene where Lefty finds Franklin's body. He finds the skeleton in the wheelchair, and he talks. I love the fact that he talks to him, and the flashlight comes on and then just fades away. It has this weird like little supernatural touch to it that
he refers to him as brother, right?
Yeah. I think as a term of endearment.
Hello, brother. Yeah. Have you watched the documentary on Cannon films? I haven't.
I did. I watched it the other night. Yeah.
And does this film feature in it?
Electric Boogaloo.
Did they discuss it much?
Yeah, it's in it. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't spend a huge amount of time on it, but yeah, the 3 films that Hooper made for. There's a really funny story about the story is primarily about the 2 producers, Golan and Globus. There's a funny story about them showing up to a screening of some I forget the name of the film. It was some historical drama that they were making, and I think anyway they were like really confused by what was going on the screen. Because the women in the film were beautiful, and they were saying, no, they're not supposed to be beautiful. They're too beautiful. They're supposed to be ugly. But it turned out that they thought that they were at a screening of Invaders from Mars, and they were upset that the aliens weren't gruesome enough. It's really, really interesting. It's a really good documentary.
Oh, really? Okay. I don't mean to sound surprised there. Oh, really? Oh, wow. No, it's one I should definitely get to. This film's like 101 minutes. It doesn't feel it. Like, it gets a little draggy towards the end, I think. But for the most part, it feels very kind of tight in a way, even though it's a weird structure. And another thing I wanted to comment on is the cinematography by Richard Kouris. Like, the colour that this film has in a way that which also assists, I think, in establishing it as very different tonally. I think this film's a very tonally ambitious film anyway. But the cinematography, I think, is like amazing. Like, just the color involved, and part of why I respond so well to that scene in which Chop Top's beating up Lefty, and when not Lefty, LG, when he arrives at the radio station, is just the richness of the visual information in that scene is just amazing.
Yeah. I also love the final scene where Stretch climbs out of the caverns and makes her way up onto into the room inside the standing rock, and finds this, like, it's basically like a throne room where the matriarch of the Sawyer family's like rotten, like not rotten, but her her skeleton, her dusty old skeleton is seated there on the throne with a huge chainsaw.
Yeah.
And when she's being pursued by Chop Top, and when she takes the chainsaw, she rips the chainsaw away from their grandmother, and like her arms come with it, and it's at that point that Chop Top says, "You killed her."
Yeah.
Which is really cool, like this idea of like this really weird perspective on death, because like in the original film where they wheel out, or like where she runs upstairs and she finds the grandfather and the grandmother just sitting in their wheelchairs, like apparently dead, like apparently long dead.
Yeah.
And then they bring Grandpa to dinner, and it turns out Grandpa's not dead.
Yeah.
And he starts, and you only realize that when they cut Sally's finger and put it in his mouth, and he starts sucking the blood out of her finger. Yeah. It's really surreal. Like it doesn't make literal sense that this guy is alive.
It's true. It's true. That's
that's
there in the first film.
And these kind of blurred boundaries between life and death, and between humans and other animals from the perspectives of this family of cannibals. I absolutely loved the film when I rewatched it this time, having liked it when I saw it for the first time 10 years ago, but feeling a little bit thrown by how different it was from the original. But I absolutely adored it this time.
Yeah, okay. What would it be out of 10 for you?
That's a 9.
Okay. 2 stars for me.
2 stars?
Yeah, it's 2 stars.
Okay.
Which, I'll go on, then I'll translate it without you having to ask. It's a strong 8 for me. Strong 8 out of 10. Yeah. Shall we move on?
Okay. We move on to the 2 Jakes.
Time changes things. Like the fruit stand that turns into a filling station. But the footprints and signs from the past are everywhere. They've been fighting over this land ever since the first Spanish missionary showed the Indians the benefits of religion, horses, and a few years of forced labor. The Indians had it right all along. They respected ghosts. You can't forget the past any more than you can change it. Hearing Catherine Mulray's name started me thinking about old secrets, family, property, and a guy doing his partner dirt. Memories are like that, as unpredictable as nitro, and you never know what's gonna set one off. Like the clues that keep you on the right track are never where you look for them. They fall out of the pocket of somebody else's suit you pick up at the cleaners. They're in the tune you can't stop humming that you never heard in your life. They're at the other end of the wrong number you dial in the middle of the night. The signs are in all those old familiar places you only think you've never been before. But you get used to seeing them out of the corner of your eye, and you end up tripping over the ones that are right in front of you. I should have been wise to Berman's hand-wringing act from the very beginning. It was as plain as the shoes on his feet.
Right, so where to begin with this? How does one synopsize it? I'm guessing, as the person who suggested this film to watch, because neither of us had seen it before, and as the person who suggested this as a discussion point for this episode, I'm going to be the one burdened with synopsizing it, I suppose. Okay, so it's set. The 2 Jakes is set in 1948 Los Angeles, 11 years after the events of Chinatown, the 1974 Roman Polanski film. This was made. Was released in August 1990. Directed by Jack Nicholson, star of Chinatown, star of this, the sequel to it. Written by Robert Towne. Produced by Robert Evans and Harold Schneider. And so, personnel distributed by Paramount. personnel, significant personnel consistencies from one film to the next. As I said, takes place 11 years after the events of the first film, in which Gittes, private investigator, having been through the war, America has seen and survived a world war in the time between the films. A private investigator, and he's hired by Jake Berman, played by Harvey Keitel, sorry, as a sort of a sting operation to catch his wife Kitty in, having an affair, committing in the act of adultery. Now, during the sting operation, the synopsis is already threatening to become longer than the film. We're only in the first scene. During the sting operation, Berman kills the man with whom his wife is having an affair. And so Gittes, Jack Nicholson, is implicated potentially in this crime because it's what were the intentions? Was it premeditated, the murder? Because it comes to light very quickly after this that the guy with whom the woman was having an affair is Jake Berman, Keitel's business partner. Still with me on this?
Mm-hmm.
So the plot proceeds, and Gittes, realizing the significance of the audio tape that he has recorded as part of this private investigation, as part of this operation, wants to keep onto the tapes that he has, the audio recording, for as long as he can. Eventually, through external sort of events and interventions, let's say, he is made to listen to the audio tape one evening and discovers on there that there's a mention of one Catherine Mulray, who is the daughter of an old flame played in Chinatown by Faye Dunaway. Now, Catherine Mulray, for reasons that I suppose we can go into, although they kind of spoil Chinatown for anyone who hasn't seen it, so you've been warned. Catherine Mulray was the outcome of her mother being raped by her mother's father. So her grandfather, Noah Cross, John Huston in the first film, is both her grandfather and father, and he was a tycoon and an evil guy and all the rest of it. Now, the discovery of Catherine Mulray's existence still, Gittes is provoked into a reluctant drive down memory lane, and the same time at which he is now wanting to find or discover the whereabouts of Catherine Mulray so that he can sort of correct past failures, if you like, and care for her and ensure that she's protected in her new life or whatever else. And as the film progresses through a very convoluted, very winding plot, discovers that Catherine Mulray, and this is a kind of a spoiler, I guess, of the film we're discussing, Catherine Mulray and Kitty, the wife of Keitel's character, are one and the same. They're the same person.
Mm-hmm.
In all of this, somewhere along the line, Gittes gets involved, kind of sexually, if not romantically, with Lillian Bodine, the wife of the guy Keitel kills, played by Madeleine Stowe. And there are different layers that emerge in this. In general, though, the strategy's the same, right? Like Chinatown, this is a neo-noir that operates within those kind of storytelling parameters, a very sort of intimate intrigue, let's say, that is also a window into a view on wider corruption within Los Angeles, but also utilizing Los Angeles as an avatar for the American political system. So in the first film, it was all about water irrigation and the corruption that undergirded that. This one turns out to be about, I think, oil.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
If
listeners, magnate who's supposed to be drilling for oil in the ocean, but he's actually secretly drilling under the property development owned by Berman and Bodine's company.
That's right.
And it
which was in development. Yeah.
Yeah, it turns out that Bodine had discovered the identity of Catherine Mulray and was, correct me if I'm wrong, blackmailing Jake Berman for his share of the company, or he knew also that there was oil underneath the development. It's all about oil anyway.
Yeah, it is. It's all about oil, as is everything. Yeah, I mean, so the plot mechanics. I mean, this film underwent kind of a famously troubled pre-production. It was meant to be released in 1985, and wasn't. Robert Towne, the writer of the film, was originally meant to play the Keitel character, and had prepared himself for doing so. And then producer Robert Evans felt that he wasn't right, and the film hit this, lots of logistical obstacles. It kind of went away for a bit. Nicholson kind of assumed the responsibility of directing it eventually, and we've got the finished product, which we're about to discuss. When was the last time you saw Chinatown?
I don't know, like 10 years ago, maybe more.
But it's a film that you remember liking, loving.
Yeah, I thought it was great. Yeah. But I was initially relieved, and this film has a pretty poor reputation. And I was initially. I kind of sighed, like when I put it on, and resigned myself to it. But I actually found myself enjoying it. About like half an hour in, I was like, why does this have such a low reputation? It's another case of a sequel to a like all-time classic that is merely good, and therefore is terrible. Which we've talked about in relation to other films like Die Hard 2 and Home Alone 2 and things like that as well. But the more it revealed itself to be very bound up with what had happened in Chinatown, though, the more it kind of lost me and confused me, and the more I regretted not having
familiarity with it. Right?
Yeah. The more I regretted not having rewatched Chinatown. But I was into the initial story, the setup with the.
Do you think then that's a failing of the film, or that you didn't put the required work in, or a bit of both?
No, I just think I should have rewatched Chinatown.
Yeah. But see, I watched Chinatown more recently than you did, although even then it's like August 2013. So on a giant screen, open air in Locarno, when it had just been restored, 4K print. And I, quite embarrassingly, on the one hand, I class it as one of my favourite ever films. On the other hand, this film's, as you said, its connection and dependence upon a familiarity with the first, a connection to and dependence upon it, made me realise that maybe I don't know the ins and outs of Chinatown to the degree that I thought I did. But I think
when you watch a film like Chinatown or The Two Jakes, or a lot of noir and neo-noir, with really sort of labyrinthine plotting, how do you respond to that? Do you enjoy the intellectual demands that it makes of you in that respect, or do you find it kind of would you prefer to be focusing on other aspects of the film and find yourself so your attention sort of diverted in that direction?
I mean, I think noir in general takes much of its meaning and energy from its oniric qualities, and that even when, I wrote recently about Strange Days, the Catherine Bigelow neo-noir, science fiction neo-noir, and that for me felt like a very noirish, in the fact that even when it's not making much sense, it still has a certain drive to it, a certain thrust, a certain appeal. The big sleep. I mean, the book upon which that's based. Chandler famously said, he didn't know who had killed one of the victims in that book. So even he was getting kind of knotted up in the convoluted nature of the story. To answer your question, I like to, when I was falling in love with Chinatown and rewatching it as an adolescent, I loved the idea of getting snippets from one viewing to the next of sense. Of oh yeah, I'm really kind of beginning to comprehend how the micro details of this are mapping up and connecting with the macro kind of allegories and whatever else. So what I'm saying is a large part of my enjoyment and appreciation of more is rooted in the idea that I don't need to know everything. Right, and it hints and teases at stuff that I get and grasp without knowing, the ins and outs of it, which I think is fine. I do think this film reaches a certain point of the storytelling strikes me in some ways as bad in a certain way. It's that thing that Tarantino always said: it's fine to be confused by something if you're meant to be confused by it. As long as the storytelling's good, but at a point at which where you're meant to be kind of knowing things and it's not quite connecting, it risks kind of boring you or just turning you off. And at some point in this film, I realized I was very, very much struggling to keep up with it and connecting with it. And I think the connecting with it is key, because I can struggle with keeping up with certain things, but if I'm still feeling connected to it in a way, then it's fine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I didn't really empathize with Giddis's obsession, his inability to leave the past behind. A lot of the positive reviews of it that I've read focus on that theme, how the past haunts us, and I don't think it's terribly well articulated in the film. I actually was more interested in the conspiracy plot, and with the oil man, I found that more compelling. But
yeah, and essentially what you need is the two threads to be equally compelling, right? Because one is a window into the other, I guess. The investigation into, something as intimate as marital, adultery or whatever, leading into a broader panoramic vision of social infrastructure.
Well, I did those two things. I do think are well connected and do work, and I was into both of them. It's just that as the film goes on, particularly in the third act, it's very heavily reliant on not only the viewer's memory of what happened in Chinatown on a plot level, but also the emotional connection that you have with the relationship between Giddis and Evelyn in the original. And I just didn't really feel it,
Yeah.
So I agree. As the film went on, I found myself kind of at a distance from it in the last 30 or 40 minutes.
See, it's interesting though, because the very things that you didn't connect with are the chief appeals for me as themes, like the idea of being driven for personal reasons back into the past to correct what one might perceive as past failings. I like that, and I like the idea of never being able to correct it. No,
I like it as well. I just don't necessarily think it was.
Okay, I see.
Did you?
Yeah.
I like it as a theme and as an idea. I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in that case, I agree with you. I don't think it's very well articulated. And yet, there's much to admire here.
I think it's a reasonably good film.
Like, there's I love films anyway, and I love films based around, and not merely setting, but based around the very iconography of Los Angeles. And I love the idea of this revisiting those, but being set 11 years later, and being about the same city but a different aspect of it. So, like, you know, we've mentioned the water of Chinatown is now replaced with oil, and this was intended, I think, by as a belated sequel, and a belated entry into what was eventually going to be a trilogy. And the third one was going to be set in 1950s Los Angeles, about pollution caused by the erection of the freeway system. Which I mean, the third one sounds absolutely amazing to me, as a you know, as a theme. And you know, I love like the details here, like the, you know, the changes of suits. Like, you know, Nicholson's suit is like massive, you know, because like, you know, just changes in fashion had occurred. You know, this is like a post-war America. There's a certain, like, I mean, he's kind of cynical in Chinatown as well, but there's kind of pragmatic about it. This one, he's like just a kind of, you know, having survived the war but still haunted by something before the war. Nicholson embodies that kind of resigned cynicism very, very well, I think. You know, everything's there, like the cinematography, the tone of it, the energy. It's got a real nice, beautiful feel to it. Despite, and perhaps because of, also the one point of departure from Chinatown is the imposition of a voiceover narration here. Because you don't
actually, I was trying to remember when I was watching
Chinatown.
it. I was like, I was trying to remember, is there any voiceover narration in Chinatown?
No, I mean, you know, Chinatown for that reason is one of the, I guess, exemplars of neo-noir, you know, what became known as neo-noir. This is very much like so it's extending that tradition, but also kind of trying to reconnect with the, you know, let's say the interwar period of you know, what became noir. And it feels a little disconnected on the one hand, but on the other hand, you know, as the film was going on, I thought, you know what, Nicholson's pulling this off, actually.
Yeah. And do you think, do you know whether it was intended initially? Do you know that whether it was in Town's script originally, or whether this was something that was sort of you know, put into address
I don't know,
the plot difficulties?
That's interesting. No, because the narration doesn't really clue us in or keep us up with the
it helps. It helps a little bit.
It's more like it does.
It kind of orientates you. Like, you know, a lot of it is like when he's pulling into a new building or something like that, and he talks about who he's there to see, and there's a little bit of kind of
fair enough. I get you.
But I agree. I think it's really well shot. It's well directed. There's a lot of like nice little visual touches. I loved the scene where he's who is he interrogating? Who's wearing the face mask, the mud facial thing? In the beauty parlor. Anyway, it's freshly on her face initially, and then as his questioning gets more and more intense, it dries up and cracks. Which I thought was a really nice visual touch. There's a lot of stuff in it like that, and it's you know, really well performed. The dialogue is sharp, and like everything's there. And as I said, I found the plot initially very engaging, and it only lost me as it went along, and became confusing, but also I just found myself like not really caring that much about Catherine Mulray. You know, or the ghosts in Jake Giddis's life, you know, that kind of thing. I didn't really feel it.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I do think it nails a certain general tonal melancholy. Like that scene where he visits Khan, the old Mulray family servant, and Khan asks him, "Are you happy?" And Giddis goes, "Please, who can answer that question off the top of their head?" And then Khan says, "Anyone who's happy." And it's framed beautifully, and it's got a very nice economic, you know, suggestiveness to it. You know, like a world that's kind of having survived, you know, what now? You know, having survived I mean, like, you know, the war and whatnot, as a country that was geographically separated from the war itself, but obviously a main actor in it. And, you know, the implications and ramifications of that, I find very kind of rich as a starting point. But yeah, the film sort of, it's weird. The point at which it should be kind of making its punches, it begins to feel weirdly inconsequential.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I thought was really strange about it was his relationship with the Madeline Stowe character, with that's Bodine's wife.
Yeah,
right?
wife.
Bodine's widow.
Yeah.
Like their sex scene. What is the purpose of that? What's going on there? It comes from nowhere and goes nowhere.
Yeah, she knows more about the case than, you know, he assumes. Right?
Does she?
Like, she's kind of like in on it, no? Or have I completely misunderstood it? Because she's wanting the tape. She's wanting those tapes because she knows Mulray is mentioned on them.
Okay.
I think. Yeah,
I asked you before about what your reaction to like to heavily plotted films is. You know, like for me, I don't like it feels like an imposition on me. Like I would be drawn more to films that are not heavily plotted. You know, and so when I feel like particularly the worst offenders are spy films. Like I remember going to see Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and knowing that I was going to have a hard time, you know, and thinking, like, when the film started, thinking, okay, pay attention to names, pay attention to faces, and 20 minutes of that movie, I didn't know what was going on, and I just had to just sit there and kind of enjoy the, you know, the mise en scène and the performances. But they're the worst because every character in the film has a real name and a code name, and they're constantly talking about people who aren't in the room, and I just, like, the main problem is that I just don't really care. You know, I just don't really care that much about that kind of, it's too demanding on that level. And yeah,
see, I like it
naughty
because
noir films are similar.
What do you think of something about, like, Inherent Vice? Did you find that easy to follow?
No.
And then, so do you think then your appreciation of the film suffers because of it, or do you find that it activates a compensatory engagement with other aspects, or not?
That's a good question. I don't know. Like I still enjoyed Inherent Vice, and I enjoyed this as well to a certain point, but I suppose, yeah, I find it kind of exhausting and distancing.
Because, I mean, like, you know, my understanding, and I've not read it, but my understanding is that Pynchon's novel of Inherent Vice is also kind of, you know, playfully convoluted. But on a broad level, we can take its characters as you know, synecdoche of certain social tropes, and, you know, function as avatars of various institutions and or movements. So you can begin to read the film on broad levels. And my question then is, to what extent is a comprehension of the details required for an understanding of the broader kind of allegories at work?
I think if you don't understand the plot, and it's the plot that's driving the character from situation to situation, then you don't understand how the situations are connected, and it becomes almost like a series of vignettes. Yeah. And you have to sort of just enjoy it on that level, which is kind of how I enjoyed Inherent Vice. I just enjoyed like the performances and the visuals, you know, and yeah. So I mean, like what you're saying about taking it as an allegory and that kind of thing, like that to me is like privileging subtext over text. Like the text has to work before the subtext works for me.
Sure.
And for me, I mean, like, obviously you need plot. You know, it serves a mechanical function, but it needs to be, for me, it needs to be in the service of you know, characterization and thematic development and ideas and not even only that, but also like just like, you know, like for example in like a mission, like a good example would be like a Mission Impossible movie, which has a similarly kind of Byzantine plot, but it's in service of these action set pieces.
Yeah.
Like I must have seen the original Mission Impossible like 100 times, and I still don't know what's going on in it.
Yeah, I know what you mean. The question is, or another question is, what about films? Okay, so like Inherent Vice, are you sufficiently up for watching that again in order to understand it on a plot level more?
Like I would watch Inherent Vice again, and if I were to watch it again, that would be part of my intention, would be like, okay, I'm gonna wrap my head around it this time.
Yeah.
Same with something like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, but I don't feel driven back to it for that reason.
No. And the two Jakes, do you feel that if you did and paid, attention, do you think that you would glean more from it? That's the problem, I suspect, with this film, is that you perhaps wouldn't.
I think if I revisited Chinatown and then watched the two Jakes right afterwards, I would definitely get more out of the third act of the two Jakes.
Mm.
And maybe even more out of the whole, oil storyline as well, and how it kind of echoes the water storyline from the first one. I don't know. I did halfway through the two Jakes, as I realized where it was all starting to go, I did regret not having revisited Chinatown, which I did initially intend to do because I haven't seen it in so long. But that was a mistake. But overall, I would still say that I enjoyed it.
I'm intrigued by part of the reason why I suggested we watch it for this episode. In general, I'm intrigued by perhaps not even belated, but like sequels to films that don't demand one. I mean, arguably, no film demands a sequel, but like there are certain films that lend themselves to expansions and extensions and serial follow-ups. I mean, like, French Connection 2 is extremely difficult. Extremely different to The French Connection, and The French Connection doesn't really need a follow-up. I mean, it ends with like a documentary-style summary of what happened to the characters after the events of the film. And yet, 4 or 5 years later, there's a sequel made, and it's in a different register, and yet it's still very much connected to that world and relating to the events of the first film. I didn't know, probably because synopses don't really hint at it, but I didn't know the extent to which the two Jakes was connected to Chinatown at all. I thought it was very, very, very different.
Yeah, neither did I.
Yeah.
I mean, like, and that's the thing with a sequel like that. You could, if that were the case, if the two Jakes was just a completely different case that Jake Gittes got involved in, 10, 11 years later or whatever. That's perfectly legitimate. Like, to take a character, it's like a Sherlock Holmes kind of thing where it's like a different case.
Yeah.
But the impetus for this sequel obviously was a desire to expand on the themes of the original film, not just to put the character in another story.
Yeah.
But this came out the same year as Godfather 3. I think it's a better film. I think it's a better film than Godfather 3.
Oh, you do?
Oh yeah.
I'd have to revisit Godfather 3.
I watched the trilogy again about a year ago. I didn't like Godfather 3 really at all.
Right.
I remember saying to you that like the first two films are all about Michael's transformation from one person into another person. And then at the beginning of Godfather 3, he is simply transformed into another person. But they just skipped over that story, and like that's the interesting story. Like, how does Michael get from the place that he's at the end of the second film to where he is at the start of the third film? That's the interesting story.
Yeah, for me, I could never really get over either like Pacino's like audible like change as well from like it's like a totally different person.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like it seems like a superficial thing to say, but for me, it's just like it's not the same character.
He's also sporting a really 80s hairstyle, even though it's set in the late 70s, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fredo.
But so what would you give the two Jakes out of 10?
I gave it a 6.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a solid film.
I think I gave it 1 star. Let me just check that. January viewing tally. No, I gave it 0 stars.
Yeah, that's harsh.
Means left me cold or worse. Yeah, I think that is harsh. I'm thinking about doing, by the way, coming back to star ratings and whatnot. I'm thinking about only updating every 2 months, or so I only publish my ratings for February films at the end of March, for instance. So
that's what you will do.
I'm thinking about doing that. Yeah. No, I mean I've already published February's, but moving forward, just to give myself a little bit more space and concretizing and immortalizing my, response to a film in numeric form.
But when I started doing monthly updates, you said that monthly updates make the years go by faster.
Is that what I said?
Yeah, so we'll 2 monthly updates, not.
Maybe. I know it would still be a monthly update, but it would just be like a month.
It would be a month late.
Like 2 months. Yeah, it would be like 2 months. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I guess. I don't know. It's something I'm going through, like, a transitional period in life at the moment, as manifested in my star ratings. Nah, but if this was a 10 scoring system for me, I would probably settle on 6 as well.
Okay.
Yeah. See, that's the thing. That's the odd thing. Like, it can be 0 stars, but it could still be a 6. It's just different. It's not a ready-made translation. The star system to the 10 scoring.
You'll be back to the 10 system.
Maybe I will.
You're like Paul Newman trying to get out of the architecture business.
All right, so that leaves one more film to discuss on this episode, and it's going to be 36, also known as the 36th Precinct.
Lâche ton arme, sale poulet! À genoux! Baissez vos armes! Les mains sur la tête! Mets les mains derrière la tête! Mets derrière les mains derrière la tête! Allez, tiens-la toi! Sale pote, allez! Lâche-la! Lève-toi, je t'emmerde, toi! Ta gueule! Lâche ton arme! Lâche ton arme! Que je ça fume! Mets-toi à genoux! J'ai dit, à genoux! Voilà! Comme ça, c'est bien, ça! Mets la main derrière la tête, la putain de toi! Voilà! Le premier qui me suit, je la fume, la salope!
T'as besoin d'une gonzesse, toi? Prends-moi sa place.
Toi, t'es mort, tu restes là!
Okay, so the fourth and final film we're going to talk about today is Olivier Marchal's 36, also known as 36th Precinct and Department 36, which is a French crime thriller from 2004, starring Gérard Depardieu and Daniel Auteuil. This was another one of your picks for this week. I hadn't seen it before. Not only had I not seen it before, I had never heard of it. It obviously passed me by at the time, and it doesn't. I don't think it quite has the status that would kind of draw me back to it. So the basic plot is you've got two high-ranking police officers in different departments of the French police force who are both trying to apprehend a gang of violent armored car robbers, right? And whoever succeeds is basically next in line for the position of police commissioner, because the commissioner is retiring. The film focuses more so on Daniel Auteux's character, Leo Vrinks, who is kind of more principled, I suppose. He's less corrupt than Depardieu's character, Denis Klein. But he's also has his own sort of like, you know, code that isn't quite like by the book. But I mean, I don't really know how much more detail to go into. That's the basic setup.
Yeah, I mean, it's a relentless, that's the premise, and it very, very quickly goes beyond that and gets very twisty.
Yeah.
My memory of it, so I watched this when it was released in theatres back when French films seemed to be ubiquitous in, you know, independent or art house cinemas in the UK. They've kind of drifted off the radar a little bit, but anyway, that's another question. You know, it came with kind of strong reviews. It was compared ultimately unfavorably, but immediately understandably to Heat.
Yeah.
Michael Mann's classic, one of my very, very favorite films. Although I think 14 years ago, I was still trying to love that film rather than loving it outright. So I was intrigued by and drawn to this, on that strength alone, on that comparison alone. I hadn't watched it in the intervening years until very recently when I suggested that we watch it for this episode because I wanted to revisit it. Did you like it?
No, not at all.
No. Just wrap it up and nah. It's interesting.
I didn't know what to expect at all. I didn't read a plot summary or anything like that, so I just threw it on. And the opening scene where the two, what I thought to be criminals, were stealing the street sign off the wall.
Yeah.
I was immediately kind of intrigued and assumed that was part of some kind of plan for a future heist, that they were, like, you know, in The Wire when the kids turn the street signs around so that the cops get turned around and they can't give their location accurately.
Yeah.
I thought that they were doing something along those lines, so to aid them in their getaway. But it turns out that it's like some sort of prank, and those two guys are actually cops who are giving the stolen street sign to a retiring member of their crew.
It's a send-off gift, right?
Yeah, and they're in the basement of some bar somewhere or something like that, and they all like start shooting at the wall. And at that point, I was like kind of going, I don't know about this.
That's very, very early on.
Yeah, it's like the second scene, and then there was the armored car heist, which I thought was quite well staged, and I could immediately see where the comparisons to Heat were coming from. And then it was all downhill from there.
Yeah, so I think the Heat thing, the Heat comparison, which, you know, we have to confront because it's you know, inevitably it's there, I guess. I think extended from the fact that not only is it like cops and robbers, although it tends to be more cops and cops, but this bringing together of you know, French cinema's kind of Pacino and De Niro, I guess, Daniel Auteuil and Gerard Depardieu, who had obviously starred in films previously, but not in a film of this sort of caliber, like of this style and within this genre. Like two embodiments of opposing, conflicting sides of masculinity as coded within French police. So you know, what's interesting, what I was going to say is that my memory of this is that the film allocated more or less equal space to both of the characters, and as you said in your summary of the synopsis or the premise, it's very much weighted in favour of Leo Vrinks, the Auteuil character. And my memory also had been sort of botched in that I thought Klein, played by Depardieu, who set up as the kind of antagonist of the movie, I thought there was more of a moral grey area between the two that we came to sort of fluctuate in terms of like identifying with on-screen characters and certain allegiances and who we wanted to kind of triumph. But it's not the case at all. I mean, there's like a clearly defined protagonist of this film who, you know, through various circumstances and contingencies and plans and manipulations ends up on the wrong side, you know, of the law and framed as somebody who, you know, is very much has it stacked against them. But it's done in this kind of relentlessly slick fashion. And the film never really stops, and it has an epic feel to it. And yes, it does still clock, and yet it does still clock in under less than 2 hours. It feels for me like a movie that's been made from like a 4 or 5 part TV.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. There's a lot of time spent at the beginning where you're being introduced to what appear to be secondary storylines. Like there's a storyline regarding the either proprietor or like the wife of the proprietor of like a nightclub who's sexually assaulted, and how they take the guy who's responsible and they bring him out. The cops, Daniel Otto's crew, who are very kind of tight knit and have their own sort of like they're very much like a gang kind of within the police department. You know, they take him out to the forest and they stage a mock execution and drop him into a shallow grave as a warning, you know, to stay away from her. And then there's another thing about somebody that Vrinks Otto put in prison, getting out of prison for a day or something like what. Yeah. And he ropes him into bringing him somewhere. He kills like rival gang members and then basically blackmails Vrinks into staying silent. But in exchange for his silence, he gives him the location of the gang who've been robbing the armored cars.
Which is how he acquires his advantage in the fight in the fight for promotion. Like
it all kind of eventually comes together, but as they're jumping from story to story to story, it feels very much like, like here are the 4 or 5 storylines that we're going to follow over the next like 6 hours. How did you feel on rewatching it? Did you like it?
I felt. I mean, I didn't love it for the first time round, but had forgotten the reasons why. Forgotten much of what I felt. In fact, you know, I had the same thing. I mentioned it again, but I had the same thing with Heat for many years as well. Like I wanted to love that film, eventually did. Obviously, this is a very, very different film. But the point is that my response to it was quite similar, in that I wanted to like this more than I ultimately did, because there were certain things in it that drew me in and whatever. But I just think it just doesn't give itself enough space for anything to breathe. But then again, you know, it feels like that's kind of the point, that, you know, everything moves and ticks along, but like it doesn't do it in a kind of cohesive, harmonious fashion. It doesn't really seem like an aesthetic choice. It seems like the outcome of, you know, external sort of difficulties or whatever, or like as I said, like cut from, you know, another format. I like the film a lot more than you do, I think. Like individual components such as like music and the score, which I'd like, but it's just so like persistent, relentless, and like slick becomes after a while like a bit like trashy.
I think the score is weird.
Not in a good way.
I found the score really strange. It sounds like something out of American Beauty.
You think?
Yeah. And the cues are really strange as well. There's a scene where one of the cops falls out a window. And like when he hits the ground, this real kind of plaintive piano melody starts playing. It's really incongruous and strange. Yeah, I know what you mean. It's very persistent as well. But it, like, okay, so there's a time jump in the movie as well, where Vrinks goes to prison for 7 years, and when he gets out of prison, he reunites with his daughter, who's now a teenager, because his wife is killed. Remind me, there's a twist where she's killed by. We're led to believe that she's been murdered by Klein, by Depardieu.
Yeah. I mean, she is. I mean, she
was already dead.
Sort of responsible. Yeah, she's responsible for. He's responsible for her death because it's part of an operation that he has engineered. Yeah, and in which he's in charge.
But there's a whole thing about him having shot her, like executed her, but that's not actually what happened. We're led to believe, like Vrinks is led to believe that Klein executed his wife, but actually he just shot her when she was already dead. Isn't that right?
She's already dead, but he uses the informant's gun. He shoots her corpse basically, so it looks like she was shot. And then uses his own gun to shoot at like the person who she was with. So it looks like he's sort of saved. Like, looks like looks like an accident. It's made it to look like an accident.
There's basically like there's a twist regarding that anyway. So anyway, like when Vrinks gets out of prison, there's a whole thing about like getting the old gang back together, and he goes and meets up with the guys who used to be on his squad, and like one of them is like running a nightclub and stuff. And it's like. It just struck me as completely meaningless because we spend no time with these people. We don't know anything about them. We have no relationship with them. We have no insight into their relationship with each other. It's not like the gang in Heat, it's not like those characters' relationships. And that kind of set me thinking, and also the way that the relationship with his daughter is played in the 7 years later when she's a teenager. She's like maybe 16 or something. She hasn't seen him, never visited him in prison. He didn't want her to. And you're kind of thinking, like, are we supposed to care about this? Like, are we supposed to feel this? Because the final shot of the movie, I think, or one of the final shots is them, he and her leaving, at the airport, and it's like, they're going away together. It's supposed to be like this, like, meaningful emotional beat, but. I was just like that. I have no insight into their relationship at all. Whether I think they maybe have two scenes together in the whole movie. One when she's a little girl, and then the one where he's waiting for her outside the school when she's a teenager, and like one at her mother's funeral when he gets out of prison, and like maybe like one kind of like less significant one earlier on. But like it doesn't appear to be like the focus of the movie at all until the very, very end. And it's like, this is the most important relationship in the film. Suddenly, just because the screenwriter is telling you that it is. And then I was thinking, like, well, what are the most important relationships in the movie, right? So I have a list here of relationships in the film, okay? Right. You tell me which one you think is the key relationship and whether it's, adequately dramatized. Vrinks' relationship with Klein.
Right.
Vrinks' relationship with his wife.
Right.
Vrinks' relationship with his daughter.
Right.
Vrinks' relationship with his crew.
Right.
Klein's relationship with his wife.
Right, okay.
Klein's relationship with Vrinks' wife.
Who
we're led to believe they have some prior relationship. Vrinks' relationship with his best friend Valence. Vrinks' relationship with his informant collaborator Cillian. Or Vrinks' relationship with the woman who's attacked in the bar. They're kind of all of the major relationships in the movie that seem to have any kind of significance. I mean, I look down that list and I go, like, none of them are well written. None of them really come off the screen.
Strange, because before you threw that list at me, I thought instinctively, well, the one that's meant to be the most that on which everything else hangs is Vrinks and Klein's, I suppose. And it's hinted at that. It's hinted at that they have been past partners, perhaps, and they've been quite close to one another, and for some reason they've drifted apart. We don't really know, and we aren't given enough information to glean or infer what drove them apart. Perhaps it was to do with Camille, Brinks' wife.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the suggestion, is that there maybe was some sort of infidelity or something like that. And there's also like a departmental rivalry that's suggested at the beginning as well.
Yeah.
But I just look at that list of relationships, and it's like at one point or another throughout the film, each of those, maybe with the exception of the final two, with Cillian and the woman who's attacked in the bar, with the rest of those relationships at one point or another in the film is sort of given center stage. And very quickly then it shifts onto another one. And the result is just like this jumble of kind of a lot of nothing to me. I think the action scenes are reasonably well staged, but that was like literally I was just waiting for the next one.
To play devil's advocate here, though, for my own sake as well as, you know, yours and the conversations, but like, isn't that the case of like Heat, for instance? Like, you know, like Pacino with Natalie Portman's, you know, his stepdaughter. Like, all of a sudden that's like becomes like this suddenly important thing, but like before then it's only really kind of teased that. And see what I mean? Or
sure, yeah, you can make that argument, but it's all about the quality of what you do get with them. I don't think Heat is anywhere near as sort of fickle in its focus as 36 seems to be. And Heat is also set over a shorter period of time. It doesn't feel like this sprawling thing with like loads of backstory hinted at, and you know what I mean. It feels more like it feels more like you have like a couple of like pivotal relationships and then secondary relationships, but it doesn't feel like it's constantly shifting the focus of the film entirely from one thing to another. With no sort of rhyme or reason, the way that 36 felt to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's also very organic the way it unfolds. Heat, like here, we've got at least one I can think of, but I think there's more than one of twists being explained with flashbacks. So at the very end of the film, when you know something happens to somebody, and where it comes kind of like as a surprise, and then we have a flashback to another character saying something more that
this is with the guy who works in the nightclub now. And there's a flashback and he recognizes him or something. That's actually I actually made a note there about that. I was trying to actually remember what exactly this note referred to, and I think it was that. And it was that they seem to be going for kind of intricate noirish plotting, but it just a lot of it comes across as ludicrous contrivance. Like 7 years later, they just happen to be, you know, this kind of way. Another major difference between this and Heat, though, is that like this one, it sets up as I said, I was drawn into it in the opening, like the kind of the three scenes that open this film. Well, the second and third, or the first and third scene. I didn't particularly like the one where they're shooting the wall, but the setup of the
boys will be boys
of the gang robbing the armored cars, like it was pretty well staged, and I was like, okay, well that's what this is about. And then very quickly it transfers its attention to the woman attacked in the nightclub, and it transfers its attention to the Cillian getting out of prison and roping Vrinks into this hit and blackmailing him and stuff. And it's like, that's not what Heat does. Heat sets up this, like, the cops who are trying to catch the robbers, and then it elaborates that conflict. It doesn't start kind of jumping around into other subplots, like you know, it sets up its framework, and then it explores all those character relationships within that framework without ever leaving it.
With maybe the exception, of Dennis Haysbert, I've always felt like his trajectory in that film is, you know, because he's not part of either troupe, and it depicts his sort of arc back into the crime. I mean, you know, I think it's a fundamental part of the film, but you know, it never really. I remember 2006, so 2 years after this came out, when we were discussing The Departed, and you were very much turned on by, and I remember you having difficulty of, I remember you having difficulty in like getting to grips with the critical like terms or the vocabulary with which to kind of articulate it, but you were turned on by its dual structure,
the symmetry of it.
A film that unfolds, in a very sort of like symmetrical fashion, drawing attention to the parallels that the film itself is depicting, and I guess also released at a similar time, something like The Prestige as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that.
Obviously,
where you have obviously DiCaprio and Damon on opposite sides, like each infiltrating the other's organization, and then you have Martin Sheen and Jack Nicholson, and you have Ray Winston and Mark Wahlberg. Kind of like these reflective elements on either side of the story. I found that structure and also the rhythm with which it kind of like balances the two storylines. I think The Departed is a great film.
Yeah, me too. Do you think that this film's attempting that?
No, not really. No, I mean, it doesn't really have the same kind of symmetry. Like even if you set aside the fact that it's weighted very much in favor of the Otu storyline or the side of things, it doesn't have the same kind of like symmetry of like dramatic composition on each side. Plus, you kind of have three sides. That's another thing, is like we don't get any insight into the gang. You know?
Yeah.
We don't know anything about them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really weird, isn't it? Like, it has enough material to warrant, like, you know, a well done, as I said, like multiple part one-off serial, and maybe should be, but and it just feels like, you know, with a story time of 110 minutes, it's just
but I mean, you could strip out so much of it, like the central relationship should be the Klein-Vrinks relationship, and it should be their competition for, like, in pursuit of this gang, and instead it gets bogged down in all sorts of side plots and subplots and backstories, I was just bored for the majority of it.
There's that sequence when, like, Vrinks is, like, you know, incarcerated, and then, like, just goes on, like, his own self-appointed day release, like, tying up his parole officer, doesn't he? Like, and it, like, just so that he can, like, see his daughter or something, or his wife, and then just goes back and he's like, yeah, sorry about that, just had to see my wife and kid.
Yeah, for the day, yeah.
I'm sure. I mean, I'm probably being reductive there, and I'm sure it has some relation to the plot as well. But I mean, it's just like some things are just really ludicrous. But you know, the shootout that is sort of instigated by Klein going off.
Oh yeah.
The two police departments are brought together. I can see you just being bored by even, like, having to discuss certain scenes. No, but so the two departments have to kind of collaborate in this operation, and Klein's just like, I've had enough of this.
Yeah, Klein is told that he's subordinate in this operation, that he's subordinate to Vrinks, and he kind of resents that, and he's getting drunk. He's like sitting there swigging whiskey.
And he instigates a shootout in which, you know, Vrinks' best pal is ultimately shot and killed. But I love it how Klein is shot right at the beginning of this shootout. Obviously, just incapacitated, not because he's shot in the chest and he's wearing a bulletproof vest. Comes to just as the shootout's like winding down. He's like, "What have I missed?" and then in the next scene, when he's in the bar, obviously having caused this scene of carnage in which a colleague is killed, right? He then rings up Vrinks and just says, "It was fate, pal." Just totally trolling him. And like somebody like Depardieu can pull that off, and like obviously like Auteur is also like a great actor. I loved him in Cachet. I think he's like, I think he's really great. Depardieu for me is like on another level, just like one of the best living actors. I think, if not the best European actor, maybe that we currently have. at least. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of wasted acting talent, right? It's in the service of a, like, I can't even say like preposterous thriller, because preposterous is like should be kind of a neutral critical term. It's just,
but it doesn't it doesn't fully commit to it though. Like it doesn't really embrace its. It just has like moments where you're kind of going, what?
Yeah,
Why?
you're right. It does. It has a sheen of self-importance as well that it never really justifies. Sorry for that. Sorry for asking you to sit through that for the purpose of this episode. But that's life. That's life in the Habitus.
Yeah.
What would you give this?
I would give this a 3 out of 10.
Whoa! Nah, I wouldn't go that far. Like, I don't dislike the film. I just think that it has serious misgivings that prevent me from enjoying it to the point that I want to. I would give it like maybe a 6. Like, if the two Jakes is a solid 6, then 36 is like a low 6. I need to check now. What did I give it on my 4-star system? Yeah, I give it 1 star. Yeah. Worthy. Something of note. Not without merit. A worthwhile film with some things of note. That's what I'm settling on.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't break a bone getting that point across. I mean, it's like I would watch other films by Olivier Marchal, and I would watch even like another film within this kind of subgenre of like the French policier, based on this alone. I mean, I just think it has like structural problems that just prevent it from reaching anywhere it's attempting to be.
Okay, thank you for listening to The Habitus. My name is Bobby Lowe, and I'm here with Michael Pattison. Please follow us on SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Twitter. And thank you, and we'll see you next time.